The carriage smelled like my father's ambition and Annie Sullivan's perfume. Annie had pressed her face to the window the entire ride, watching the palace gates rise out of the dark like something from a threat, not a fairy tale. She'd been giggling since we left Barraza territory, whispering about the king's shoulders, the king's jaw, the king's everything. I hadn't said a word. I was the only wolf in that carriage who already knew how this night ended. Not with a king. Not with a choice. I was going home to Philip Sant and his father's eastern territories, and the arrangement my father Ronald Barraza had shaken hands on when I was 4 years old and couldn't yet spell my own name. This is Megan's Romance Audiobooks. If you want to see more of these stories, like and subscribe. Don't forget to comment what country you're watching from. I was attending tonight the way furniture attends a party. Present, unmoved, and belonging entirely to someone else. My wolf had been quiet for weeks. Not sleeping. Just still. The way an animal goes still when it understands on some cellular level that the cage door is about to close for good. I'd polished my boots that morning. Pressed my dress. Told myself it didn't matter what the king looked like, what the halls smelled like, what any of it felt like. I was already spoken for. Not yet, something wispier, deep from the part of me I'd learned to ignore. I didn't know what it meant. I pushed it down and followed Annie through the gates. The great hall was everything I had been told to expect, and nothing I had been prepared for. Marble floors, so pale they looked like frozen water. Chandeliers that didn't flicker. They blazed, steady and merciless, the way powerful things tend to be. The scent hit me before anything else. Hundreds of wolves packed into a space that smelled of cedar and candle wax, and underneath it all, something electric. Something that made my wolf lift her head for the first time in weeks. I pressed her back down. Annie had already dissolved into the crowd, gravitating toward Christopher Hodges' daughters like a moth toward the most expensive flame in the room. I watched her go without feeling much. The Hodge girls were exactly what this gathering was designed for. Tall, gleaming, carrying bloodlines that read like a list of territorial victories. Edmund Morrow's niece stood nearby in a gown that probably cost more than my father's best negotiation. She had the particular confidence of a woman who had never once been told she was a complication. I found a wall and stood next to it. This was my skill. The one thing I had genuinely mastered in 23 years of being Ronald Barraza's less useful daughter. I could occupy a room without disturbing it. I could watch everything and be seen by no one. My sister had the beauty, my brother had the teeth, and I had learned very early that invisibility, wielded correctly, was its own kind of armor. The king had not yet appeared. His beta, a rangy wolf named Jeremy Holmes with a scar-running jaw to collarbone, stood at the front of the hall calling names in a voice built for obedience. One by one, women approached the raised platform where an empty chair waited like a held breath. One by one, they were redirected to the eastern corridor where, rumor said, the king was conducting private assessments. I listened to the names. Mary Phillips, Anna Decker's youngest cousin. 3 women from the northern reaches whose names I didn't recognize. I was not nervous. I want to be clear about that. I was not nervous because nervousness implied stakes, and I had none. Philip Sant's father, Michael Snyder, had sent a letter to my father just 4 days ago confirming the bond announcement would proceed at month's end. I was here because Ronald Barraza had received a royal summons and could not afford the political cost of refusing it. I was here the way a signature appears on a document, necessary for the form of the thing, meaningless beyond that. My wolf disagreed. She had been pacing since we crossed the palace threshold, low and restless, circling something I couldn't identify. I pressed a hand flat against my sternum the way my mother used to do when she wanted me to breathe. Stop, I told her silently. It doesn't matter. Eugene Lewis. Jeremy Holmes's voice. My name. Spoken into a hall full of wolves who had no idea who I was. I straightened from the wall. The crowd parted without drama. Nobody whispered. Nobody watched with envy or curiosity the way they had for the Hodge daughters or Edmund Morrow's niece. I walked the length of the hall in complete, unremarkable silence. The door to the eastern corridor opened, and for the first time in my life, my wolf stopped pacing. She went absolutely, completely still, like she recognized something waiting on the other side of that door that I hadn't been told to prepare for. The eastern corridor opened into a room that was not what I expected. No guards ranked in formation. Just a long oak table, 2 chairs, and a fire burning low in a stone hearth. Maps pinned to one wall. A half-empty glass of something dark on the table's edge. The room smelled like cedar and iron and something underneath both that I couldn't name and couldn't stop noticing. Charles Ethier stood at the window with his back to me. He was larger than the rumors had accounted for. Not in the way powerful men are often described, not theatrical, not performing it. Just genuinely, quietly enormous, the way old trees are large. Like the size had accumulated over time rather than been constructed for effect. Dark hair. Shoulders that carried the specific tension of a man who had not fully relaxed in years. He didn't turn when I entered. Sit, he said. Not unkindly. Not kindly either. He said. He turned eventually, and I made myself hold still under the assessment of his eyes. Gray. Pale and steady as overcast sky, the kind that doesn't threaten rain. It simply refuses to promise sun. He looked at me the way I had watched him look at no one else through the corridor's observation glass while I waited. The other women had received a glance. A cataloging. He looked at me like he was reading something written in a language he'd almost forgotten. Eugene Lewis, he said. Barraza territory. Yes. Your father is Ronald Barraza. Yes, Your Majesty. A pause. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat, which surprised me. He hadn't sat for any of the others. You're unmated, he said. Yes. Why? I had heard he asked this question. Every woman in the corridor had been warned. I had prepared an answer that was technically true and revealed nothing. But sitting across from those gray eyes with my wolf inexplicably silent in my chest, my prepared answer dissolved. I haven't chosen anyone, I said. Or, no one has chosen you? It landed without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. He wasn't trying to wound me. He was just precise. Both, probably, I said. Until recently. Something shifted in his expression. Subtle, but I caught it. Until recently, he repeated. You have an arrangement. My father has an arrangement. With Michael Snyder, Philip's son. And you. His voice was careful now, the way hands are careful around something that might break or bite. Do you consider yourself promised? I should have said yes. It would have been accurate. It would have ended the conversation and sent me back to the hall, and eventually back to the carriage, and eventually back to the life already assembled and waiting. Instead, I heard myself say, not yet. The fire cracked in the hearth. Charles Ethier went very still. Not the stillness of a man processing information. The stillness of a predator who has just heard something move in the dark. His eyes hadn't left my face, but they changed, the pale gray deepening, something surfacing underneath the controlled surface like pressure building beneath ice. Not yet, he said quietly. The ceremony hasn't happened, I said, because suddenly I felt the need to explain. Nothing is sealed. I only meant. I know what you meant.
His voice had dropped.
And in the way he said it, measured and low and stripped of its earlier formality, I understood with absolute clarity that he had heard something else entirely. He stood. The assessment was over. But the way he looked at me as I rose to leave was not the look of a man who was finished. Annie Sullivan was escorted out of the palace at 9:30. I watched from the window of a guest room I had not been assigned so much as deposited in, by a palace attendant who had offered no explanation beyond, "The king requests you remain." Annie looked up as the carriage pulled away, scanning the upper windows with an expression caught between envy and genuine alarm. I didn't wave. I wasn't sure what I would have been waving about. The room was small but not unkind. A narrow bed, a writing desk, a window that faced the inner courtyard where, below, the last carriages were rolling back through the palace gates, carrying every other woman who had come tonight with hope or calculation or both. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about Philip Sant, not with longing.
I want to be honest about that.
I thought about him the way you think about a weather forecast, with a kind of resigned practicality, noting the conditions you'll have to move through regardless of preference. Philip was not cruel. He was 29, adequately handsome, the sole heir to Michael Snyder's Eastern Territories, and he had shaken my hand once at a formal dinner 3 years ago and not spoken to me again since. Our arrangement existed entirely in the language of our fathers. Acres and alliances and pack strength on paper. I had told myself for years that it was enough. Sitting in a palace guest room at the king's request, I was finding that argument considerably harder to make. A knock at the door. Not tentative. Jeremy Holmes stood in the corridor, scar catching the lamplight, expression neutral in the practiced way of men who deliver uncomfortable news professionally. "A message has been sent to your father," he said, informing him you'll remain at the palace for an unspecified period at the king's request. And Michael Snyder? Something flickered across Jeremy's face. Almost amusement. Gone quickly. That's not my department. What is your department exactly? Making sure the king's decisions are executed without complication. He looked at me steadily. You don't seem like a complication. I'm not sure that's a compliment. It is, he said and left. I didn't sleep well. My wolf was restless in a way she hadn't been in years. Not anxious, which I could have managed, but alert, oriented, like she was listening for something specific through the palace walls and finding it at irregular intervals, and each time she did, something in my chest pulled tight and released in the same breath. I didn't examine that too closely. In the morning, a palace attendant brought breakfast and a note. Just 4 words in handwriting that was spare and exact, the penmanship of a man who wrote with intention and no decoration. The library. After breakfast. I read it twice. I thought about Philip Sant's handshake. 3 years ago. One time. The sum total of his investment in the woman his father had purchased on his behalf. I thought about gray eyes reading my face like something written in a language almost forgotten. I thought about not yet, and what I had meant by it, and what he had heard, and whether those 2 things were actually as different as I had been telling myself since last night. I folded the note, put it in my pocket. My wolf, for the first time in longer than I could remember, was not still. She was waiting. The library was nothing like the one at home. Ours held 3 shelves of pack law, 2 decades of Ronald Barraza's correspondence, and a collection of territorial maps my father consulted the way other men consulted prayers. Useful. Transactional. A room built entirely for leverage. This one had been built for something else. Floor-to-ceiling shelves that required ladders on brass rails. A reading table long enough to seat 12. Light coming in from high windows at an angle that made the dust motes look intentional, like someone had arranged them. The smell of old leather and parchment so thick it was almost a physical thing. Charles was already there when I arrived. He stood at the far end of the table with a document open in front of him, reading with the focused stillness of a man who had learned to work through everything, including interruption. He didn't look up immediately. I didn't announce myself. I simply walked to the nearest shelf and began reading spines, because it seemed better than standing in the doorway waiting to be acknowledged. You didn't ask why you were kept. His voice, without looking up. Would the answer have changed anything?
I said.
A pause. Then no. Then it seemed like an inefficient question. He looked up at that. The gray eyes moved over my face with that same quality from last night. Reading, not cataloging. There was a difference I was learning. Cataloging was what he'd done to the others. Reading was something that required the subject to be worth the effort. He pulled out the chair across from his without a word.
He said.
For a while neither of us spoke. He returned to his document. I found a book on Northern Pack territories I had no practical reason to read, and read it anyway. The silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised me more than anything that had happened since I walked through the palace gates. I had grown up in a house where silence was a weapon. Here it felt like something else, like shared air. Like two people who had both spent considerable energy performing for rooms full of people and had silently agreed, without discussion, not to do that here. Then Jeremy Holmes entered without knocking. He crossed to Charles and placed a letter on the table with the careful precision of a man delivering something he'd rather not. Charles read it without expression. Finished. Set it down. Michael Snyder, he said. Not a question. Arrived this morning, Jeremy said, via the Eastern Courier. He's requesting formal confirmation that Miss Lewis will be returned per the terms of the Baraza arrangement within the week. Jeremy paused. He used the word returned. The room temperature didn't change. Charles's expression didn't change. But something in the air did. Noted, Charles said quietly. That will be all. Jeremy left. Charles did not return to his document. He looked at me instead, and I made myself hold the weight of it without flinching, without performing calm I didn't entirely feel, because my wolf had gone rigid the moment Jeremy said Philip's father's name, and something about the word returned was sitting in my chest like a stone I couldn't dislodge. You knew this was coming, Charles said. I knew my father couldn't ignore a royal summons, I said. I also knew Michael Snyder doesn't misplace assets. Is that what you are? I held his gaze. According to every document my father has signed in the last 19 years? Yes. Charles looked at me for a long moment. And according to you, he said. I didn't have an answer. That, I realized, was the most honest and most terrifying thing I had admitted in years. Mary Phillips had worked in the palace for 22 years. She was a compact woman with silver-streaked hair. She wore pinned back with the efficiency of someone who had no patience for things that didn't serve a purpose, including conversation. She ran the household with the quiet authority of someone who had outlasted 3 of Charles's council members and intended to outlast several more. The staff moved around her the way water moves around a stone, not because she demanded it, but because her presence simply reorganized a room without effort. She found me in the corridor outside the library on the 3rd morning, carrying a stack of fresh linens that she clearly did not need me to help with, and fell into step beside me anyway. You're not what they expected, she said. I'm aware. I don't mean it as criticism. She glanced at me sideways. The last woman who stayed past the first night left in tears before breakfast. You've been here 3 days and you've eaten every meal without looking like you're waiting for permission. I considered that. Should I be performing more anxiety? Absolutely not.
A pause.
He notices, that you don't. We walked in silence for a moment. I had learned, in 3 days, that Mary Phillips did not make small talk. Every sentence she offered was load-bearing. Tell me about Eleanor Pipes, I said. She didn't break stride, didn't flinch, but something in her shoulders settled, like she'd been waiting for the question and was deciding, in real time, whether to answer it honestly. What do you already know? She said. That there was an arrangement. That it ended. That whatever happened afterward is the reason half this palace walks on glass around him. Mary was quiet for long enough that I thought she'd decided against it. Then she said, Eleanor Pipes was contracted to Charles before he took the throne. Old Pack Alliance. Her family's territory bordered the northern reach. Strategically valuable, her father was an ally of Charles's father. She turned a corner. I followed. She didn't want it.
Which was her right.
But Eleanor didn't simply decline. What did she do? She announced her refusal at a full-pack gathering. 14 packs in attendance. Made a considerable speech about her freedom to choose her own bond. Mary's voice was measured, not cruel. She wasn't wrong, exactly. But she chose the most public stage she could find. And she laughed at the end of it. Not cruelly, I don't think she intended cruelty. But she laughed, and 14 packs heard it, and Charles was 22 years old and already fighting to be taken seriously by men twice his age who were looking for any proof that he was soft. I stopped walking. Mary stopped too. He wasn't heartbroken, I said slowly. He was humiliated. Both, Mary said quietly. In the beginning, I think both. But heartbreak heals if you let it. Humiliation, when you're a young king trying to hold 3 territories together with nothing but nerve and reputation. She shook her head. He decided that wanting something was the same as handing someone a weapon. And he's governed himself by that ever since. She looked at me directly for the first time in the conversation. 7 years is a long time to hold a wall up, she said. It becomes the whole architecture eventually. You forget there was ever anything else. She adjusted the linens in her arms and continued down the corridor. I stood where she'd left me, turning over what she'd said, hearing it settle into the shape of something I recognized in my own chest. 2 people, 2 different cages, built by 2 different humiliations. And somehow we'd both ended up in the same library. Anna Decker had the kind of stillness that made you want to confess things. She was the palace physician, not the healer, the physician, a distinction she made exactly once and with complete pleasantness and absolute finality. She had worked for Charles for 11 years, which meant she had known him before Eleanor, during Eleanor, and through everything that came after. She was perhaps 50, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes the color of dark amber that missed nothing and judged very little, at least visibly. She found me in the infirmary on the 4th day. I had wandered there that morning the way I wandered most places in the palace, not aimlessly, but following the pull of usefulness. The infirmary was quiet, well-stocked, and organized with the logic of someone who understood that emergencies don't wait for convenient timing. I had been reorganizing the herb cabinet, not because anyone asked me to, but because whoever had organized it last had put the wound-clotting agents behind the digestive remedies, which was the kind of thing that wouldn't matter until it suddenly critically did. Anna stood in the doorway watching me for a full minute before she spoke. "You know what you're doing," she said. "My father taught me field medicine from the time I could follow instruction," I said. "I'm not formally trained. Formal training is overrated. Instinct and early habits are harder to teach." She crossed the room and examined my reorganization without touching it. Nodded once, which I understood was significant. You've been here 4 days and you've already made yourself useful in 3 separate areas of this palace. I don't do well without something to do. Neither does he. She said it without emphasis, as if she were noting the weather. Then she turned and looked at me directly, with those amber eyes that made confession feel like a reasonable option. Sit down, Eugene. He said. She pulled a stool from beneath the examination table and sat across from me with the unhurried ease of someone who had conducted 10,000 difficult conversations and learned that rushing them only produced incomplete answers. I'm going to ask you something, she said, and I want you to actually answer it. Not the answer that's safe or the answer that's modest or the answer that protects you from wanting something you're not sure you're allowed to want. I said nothing, which she seemed to take as agreement. What do you want? For words. Quiet and direct, the way she did everything. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Anna waited. She was extraordinarily good at waiting. The silence stretched and I let it, because something about the question had landed in a place I hadn't accessed in so long that the path to it was overgrown. What did I want? Not what was arranged for me. Not what Ronald Barraza had decided I was for. Not what Michael Snyder's letter had referred to as an asset pending return. What did I want? My wolf stirred, and immediately I understood the problem. Because the answer that rose first, before I could redirect it or qualify it or bury it under practicality, was not an abstract answer about freedom or autonomy or escape from Philip Sant's indifferent handshake. It was specific. It had gray eyes and spare handwriting and the particular stillness of a man who had been performing strength for so long he'd forgotten what rest felt like. I don't know, I said. Anna looked at me for a long moment. Yes, you do, she said gently. That's what's frightening you. She stood, returned the stool to its place, and left me alone in the infirmary with the herb cabinet and the answer I wasn't ready to say out loud. I couldn't sleep. This was not new. I had not slept cleanly since the night before the gathering, when I had lain awake in my childhood bed running through the arithmetic of my own life and finding the numbers consistently, quietly depressing. But tonight was different. Tonight the wakefulness had a direction to it. A pull. I found myself in the library at 11:30 without having consciously decided to go there. The fire had burned low. Someone kept it going through the night. Palace staff, presumably, the invisible machinery of a household that never fully stopped. The room was amber and shadow, the high shelves disappearing into darkness above the reach of the firelight. I took my usual chair, pulled my knees up, and didn't bother pretending I was there for the books. I heard him before I saw him. Not footsteps. Just a change in the quality of the air, the way a room shifts when someone with significant presence enters it. Charles stood in the doorway in a dark shirt with no formal jacket, sleeves pushed to his elbows, holding a document he clearly hadn't been reading. He looked at me without surprise. You're in my chair, he said. You have an entire palace of chairs. He came in anyway and took the one across from mine, the one I had privately begun thinking of as his regardless of who technically owned the room. He set the document on the table without looking at it again. We sat in the fire's low light and said nothing for a while, which had become, over 4 days, its own kind of language. Mary told me she spoke to you, he said finally. She told you. Mary tells me most things. She considers it part of her professional responsibility. A pause. She also told me you reorganized the infirmary and that Anna is quietly delighted about it. The wound agents were behind the digestive remedies. I'll have someone executed. I looked at him. The corner of his mouth had moved. Barely. I was learning his scale of expression, where a fraction of movement carried the weight that other people's full smiles did. Then the almost smile faded. "She told you about Eleanor," he said. Not a question. Yes. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he'd decided to leave it there. Then he said, "What she told you was accurate. But there's a part Mary doesn't know because I've never said it to anyone." I waited. "I wasn't in love with Eleanor Pipes," he said. "I want to be honest about that. The arrangement was strategic, and I had accepted it as such. But I had decided to try." He looked at the fire. "I had decided that trying was something I was capable of, that I could build something real from a political foundation if both people were willing."
He paused.
"She laughed," he said quietly, "and every alpha in that room heard it. And what I felt in that moment wasn't heartbreak. It was the absolute, concrete confirmation of something I had suspected since I was young enough to understand what I was being prepared for."
He looked at me.
"That wanting something gives it power over you. That the moment you try, you've already handed someone the means to undo you." The fire cracked softly. "So you stopped trying?" I said. "I stopped wanting," he corrected. "Trying implies you still want the outcome." I removed the want entirely. "It's cleaner." "It's lonelier," I said quietly. The gray eyes held mine. "Yes," he said, like the word cost him something. "It is." Philip Sant arrived on a Tuesday. I knew before Jeremy Holmes came to find me. My wolf had been restless since morning, pacing a circuit I couldn't quiet, and the particular tension that moved through the palace staff, that subtle tightening, the way people find reasons to be elsewhere, told me something had shifted in the air before anyone said a word. Jeremy found me in the infirmary.
"He's here," he said.
Nothing else required. Philip was in the great hall with two of Michael Snyder's senior pack men flanking him like parentheses around a statement that expected no argument. He was exactly as I remembered. Adequately handsome. Composed in the way of men who have never had a reason to be otherwise. He wore his father's colors and his father's expression, the particular patience of someone who considers waiting a courtesy they are extending rather than a position they occupy. He saw me and smiled. "Eugene. Warm enough. Practiced enough. You look well." "Philip." "The terms are settled. The alliance benefits both territories. Eugene understands the arrangement." Philip glanced at me, and in his eyes was something I recognized. Not cruelty, not malice, just the genuine, uncomplicated assumption that I would agree. That I had always been going to agree. That my presence in this palace was an administrative delay in an outcome that had never actually been in question. He had never once considered that I might want something different. Neither had I until recently. "Eugene," Philip said. "Tell him. Tell him the arrangement has always been the plan." The hall was very quiet. I felt Charles beside me, not touching, not intervening, simply present in the way a wall is present, solid, unmovable, and entirely my choice whether to lean against it. I thought about Ronald Barraza's handshake when I was 4 years old. About 19 years of a future assembled without my input. About Philip Sant's one handshake 3 years ago and the silence that had followed it like a verdict. I thought about a library at midnight and gray eyes saying yes, it is lonelier like the admission costs something real. I looked at Philip. "The arrangement was always your father's plan," I said. "And my father's. I was the subject of it, not a party to it." I paused. "There's a difference." Philip's composure slipped. "Just slightly. Just enough. Eugene." "She's given her answer." Charles's voice. Quiet and final as a door closing. "I suggest you give her the courtesy of hearing it." Philip looked between us. And for the first time since I'd known his name, He looked uncertain. Philip Sant left before dinner. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no ultimatum issued, and refused. He simply looked at me for a long moment in the great hall with the expression of a man recalculating something he'd assumed was settled, and then he nodded once, with a stiffness that was probably the closest he came to genuine feeling, and left with his father's men behind him like a tide going out. Jeremy Holmes closed the palace doors. The great hall emptied. Staff found other corridors. Charles and I were left standing in the middle of the marble floor in the particular silence that follows something that cannot be undone. "Your father will be furious," Charles said. "Yes." "Michael Snyder will dissolve the Eastern Alliance." "Probably. You'll lose the arrangement and everything attached to it." I turned to look at him. "I know." He studied me with those gray eyes that had been reading me since the first night, patient and precise, as if he was checking his translation against the original text one final time. "What are you keeping?" he said quietly. "If you give all of that up, what are you left with?" It was the most honest question anyone had ever asked me. I thought about Anna Decker's amber eyes. "What do you want?" I thought about 4 words I hadn't been able to answer in the infirmary with the herb cabinet reorganized and the right answer sitting directly in front of me. Too frightening to touch. "Myself," I said. For the first time, actually myself. Charles moved toward me the way he did everything, without performance, without hesitation once the decision was made. He stopped close enough that I could see the exact shade of gray in his eyes, the way the firelight from the wall sconces caught in them. "I stopped wanting things 7 years ago," he said. "I was precise about it. Deliberate. I convinced myself it was strength, and not just fear, wearing strength's clothing." "I know," I said softly. "And then you sat across from me in that room and said not yet like you had every confidence in the world that what you were waiting for was actually coming." His voice was low, like wanting something hadn't broken you yet, and you saw no particular reason it should. "It had broken me," I said. "I was just quieter about it than you." Something shifted in his face. The last wall, I thought. The last held breath. He reached out and touched my face with the careful deliberateness of a man who had told himself for years that this was something he no longer did. His thumb traced my cheekbone like he was memorizing the architecture of it. My wolf went completely, utterly still. And then the bond arrived. Not violently. Not like the crack of something breaking. It came the way dawn comes, gradually, then all at once. Warmth spreading from the center of my chest outward until every edge of me was lit with the knowledge of him.
His exhaustion.
His relief. The enormous, carefully contained tenderness of a man who had been carrying his own heart like something broken he hadn't gotten around to discarding. I felt him feel me feeling it. His breath released like he'd been holding it for 7 years. "Eugene," he said. Just my name. Like it meant something different now than it had 5 seconds ago. "I know," I whispered. He pulled me in and held on, and my wolf, who had been still and waiting and quietly certain since the moment we crossed the palace threshold, finally rested. Ronald Barraza came to the palace 6 weeks later. Not to negotiate. That was how I knew something had changed in him. He arrived without a prepared position, without Michael Snyder's letters in his coat pocket, without the particular set to his jaw that meant he had already decided the outcome before entering the room. He arrived looking like a man who had realized, recently and with difficulty, that he had made a series of errors he could not invoice his way out of. I met him in the courtyard. We stood in the pale morning light, my father and I, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. He looked older than I remembered. Or perhaps I was simply seeing him differently now, not as the architect of my life's constraints, but as a man who had confused provision with love for so long he genuinely stopped knowing the difference. "You look well," he said finally. "I am well." He nodded, looked at the palace walls, looked back at me. "The Snyder alliance is finished." "I know. I signed away considerable leverage when I agreed to that arrangement." A pause. "I thought I was securing your future." "I know that too," I said. "And I did." That was the complicated part. Ronald Barraza had never been malicious. He had simply never once thought to ask me what I wanted, and it had never occurred to him that this was a form of harm. "Charles Ethier is a good king," my father said. "It cost him something." "He's a good man," I said. "The king part is secondary." Ronald looked at me then, really looked, with the expression of someone encountering a version of his daughter he hadn't known existed, and was trying to determine whether he'd missed her becoming this, or whether she had always been this and he'd simply never looked directly at her before. I thought it was probably the latter. "I'd like to visit," he said quietly. "If that's permitted." "It's permitted," I said. "It's even wanted. But you come as my father, not as a negotiator. There's nothing left here to broker."
He absorbed that.
Nodded once, with a stiffness that was the closest Ronald Barraza came to humility. We walked inside together. Charles was in the library, where he spent most mornings, correspondence open in front of him, and a second cup of coffee on my side of the table that had simply started appearing there at some point, placed without comment, as if it had always been part of the morning's architecture. He stood when we entered, met my father's eyes with the steady gray gaze that had once read me like a language he'd almost forgotten. My wolf, warm and settled in my chest, recognized home. Not the palace. Not the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and brass rail ladders and amber morning light. Him. Just him. That night, when the palace had gone quiet and Charles and I sat by the dying fire in our library, his hand covering mine on the armrest with the easy certainty of something that had always been true and simply required time to become visible, I thought about the carriage ride. Annie Sullivan's perfume. My father's ambition. My wolf gone still in my chest like an animal that understood the cage door was closing. Not yet. She had whispered. She had known before I did. She had always known. If this story found you at the right moment, if Eugene and Charles felt like something you needed today, please subscribe to Megan's Romance audiobooks and hit the bell so you never miss a new story. A like takes 2 seconds and tells us to keep going. We have more stories coming, and every single one is made for you.